So I guess I'll use this as my segue to talk about the book I'll be presenting on, which is the book Civil Religion and the Enlightenment in England, which is written by my colleague Ashley Walsh. And this book was very interesting for me because when I came to this, I, like most people, I think, associate this concept of civil religion with Rousseau. And I think Ashley's very conscious of this fact. And we know that Rousseau believed that Republican nationalism could serve as a base of social unity, that he sought this idea of a civil religion that could actually replace religion. And this concept often has been attached with a certain stigmatism, I think. Scholars like Jacob Talman, like Francois Furet, they've claimed that this Rousseauvian civil religion, with its communitarian and universal pretensions, I think provided the origins of modern totalitarianism. So this book, however, argues that we might consider alternative ideas of civil religion that promoted notions of tolerance, promoted ideas of religious sensibilities, and which were not grounded in the secular ideas of the so-called radical Enlightenment, as Jonathan Israel has deemed it. So with this book, we see Hanoverian thinkers who are endeavoring to construct a civil religion that is vested in ideas of Christian reform and a return to pure Christianity. And this stems from the anti-papal precedent that was set by the Reformation, of course. But what I thought was even more interesting is that it also stems, according to the argument, from the social and political turmoil that accompanied the civil wars and the revolution of 1688 in England. And so in this respect, Ashley's book is looking at the Hanoverian England as a post-revolutionary society. And it's one in which various elites were concerned with questions of how do you foster civil peace? How do you foster social accord in order to unify the kingdom and create a model of a Christian commonwealth? And in looking at this project, as this book notes, writers and intellectuals believe that the established church in England could contribute to creating shared and public forms of worship and new types of behavior that would resolve internal conflicts and serve as a base of an enlightened and a tolerant society. I think one of the most enjoyable aspects of this book was its panoramic approach. It examines a variety of thinkers, from intellectuals like Bolingbroke and Gibbon to, I think surprisingly, David Hume. But also it takes into account the opinions of Anglican churchmen and notable dissenters like Richard Price. And I think when we can look at all these elites, we notice that they are all concerned with transforming the established church into an institution that could create, as Ashley says, pious patriots. And how could this church foster a unified Christian commonwealth? But another aspect of this is Ashley is very sensitive to the variety of ideas that surround this subject. So civil religion is hardly a monolithic concept, and I think this book really does a good job of demonstrating that. This idea of civil religion, it grapples with sort of central questions concerned with the role of the clergy in an enlightened society, the nature of power between sovereign and church, and also how to regulate religion in the public sphere. But also, despite these various outlooks that are studied in this book, I think there are key themes that bind Hanoverian intellectuals together. And I think above all, what Ashley shows is to what extent their ideas were oriented toward the goal of creating a harmonious civic order that would discourage religious feuds, that would produce virtuous and tolerant citizens befitting an enlightened commonwealth. Now, in treating this very expansive and I should say ambitious topic, I think this book makes a very significant contribution to a few key areas of study. Naturally, the first is the Enlightenment. This book challenges the traditional narrative of the Enlightenment as a movement toward greater secularization, and it argues for a post-secular reading of modernity that takes religious thought and practices very seriously. And so in this respect, it contributes, I think, to a more pluralistic view of the Enlightenment. It expands upon ideas of the religious Enlightenment that occurred in the 18th century, a concept that was popularized by David Sorkin and others. But I also think it has something to offer for intellectual history as well. One of the things I really appreciate about this is that Ashley takes ideas seriously. And in showing the various strains of Hanoverian civil religion, this book demonstrates the interactions of ideas and the multiplicity that was evident within Enlightenment thinking at the time. Now, I think also just to kind of sum up and perhaps pose some questions to think about, examining civil religion outside of a strictly Rousseauvian context, I think it raises issues that might be relevant to other nations. And I'm thinking here of France, obviously, even though France is kind of juxtaposed against England. This book, reading it, made me wonder to what extent these types of ideas had been instrumental in informing the views and actions of the French clergy during the revolutionary period, in fact. We know that historians like David Bell have noted the importance of religion within the debates that were surrounding early ideas of French nationalism and patriotism. And we also know that religious authorities like Sieyès, like the Abbé Grégoire, they came to support the revolution in 1789. So in reading this book, it made me think perhaps we might wonder to what extent ideas about civil order based on religious reform and harmonious church-state relations might have motivated some of these clerics. And I think here, there might be a further application to consider the Enlightenment and post-secular paradigms that are explored in this book. And while I could speak at length on this book, it is a very complex book and the arguments are very nuanced. I think I'm going to turn it over to the author now, and he can give his sort of assessment of his own work.
Good, I'm on. Good. Well, thank you very much, Gavin, for that very warm and expansive and thorough analysis of the book. I'm very grateful indeed. And I think the more I reflect on it, actually, the more I think what a good place I've ended up in Cardiff, since there are so many people who work on political religion and the concept, the apparatus and application of political religion theory. And as Gavin opened up by saying, there's a very clear overlap in the historiography of civil religion in the writings of Karl Popper, Talman, some name checked by Gavin. We have, if you like, the elision of political with the civil, and the writings of Rousseau, through a particular reading of the Enlightenment, become the basis for modern totalitarianism. So I think there are lots of intellectual overlaps with other members of the department here that we haven't really explored, and we might want to discuss further. But I think the French point is extremely valuable. Gavin, all of the examples he raised all demonstrate that there's a very strong sense in which the French Revolution can be read as a result of the failure of the French Reformation. And Jansenists, various church reformers who were keen to draw on Gallican tradition, were involved in the drafting of the civil constitution of the clergy. Dale Van Clay, a historian who retired actually quite a long time ago now from Ohio State University, wrote a series of extremely valuable books showing how the failure to use royal authority in the Gallican Church gave the opportunity to more radical reformers, as happened in the later stages of the French Revolution. So taking research further into the European angle would be extremely valuable. And of course, I dwell a lot on Tocqueville and Tocqueville's reflections on why England avoided a revolution and how anti-clericals and deists, skeptics, like Hume and Bolingbroke, came in the end to support the church in a way that the philosophes in France simply couldn't bring themselves to do. So that was also a point amusing for me. Thank you very much again, Gavin.